Welcome back. Well, Sami al-Hajj's release coincided with Press Freedom Day. A number of media organizations noted many setbacks in the work of journalists worldwide. According to Freedom House, an independent watchdog, global press freedoms actually declined in 2007. In its annual survey of political rights and civil liberties worldwide, Freedom House says press freedoms in South Asia, the former Soviet Union, the Middle East and North Africa, as well as sub-Saharan Africa, suffered a reverse. But it's not only press closure and mass arrests that journalists have to contend with. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, close to 100 journalists were killed last year worldwide because of their work. And in most cases, the murders went unpunished. And whilst Iraq remains the most dangerous place to work, peacetime democracies such as Mexico, the Philippines and Russia have also seen their share of killings. Well, joining us again are our guests in Khartoum, Wadda Khanfar, in London, Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, and in Washington, D.C., Frank Smith. Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, are we as likely to find the intimidation, incarceration and even killing of journalists in democracies as well as dictatorships?
Well, yes, we do. And I think the point you mentioned earlier about asking, for example, Sami al-Hajj to spy, which I thought was also another odd thing to ask, because the journalists are people whose work is open for everybody to scrutinize. You don't need to spy on journalists. They themselves give the information out, especially. So there was, I think, what they wanted in this case was to intimidate by making him to make charges or lies about Al Jazeera. But what is worrying, I think, for us is this connection between the war on terror and attacks on freedom of the press. Because in the Arab world and elsewhere, there has been people saying that we need more curbs on the press to combat terrorism. And I think in this regard, also the West and the US have come in support of these measures by passing laws and so by encouraging regimes which are fighting the freedom of the press. So there are some worries, yes.
Frank Smith, the CPJ report says 95 journalists were killed in 2007. 8 of those killed were in Somalia. Now, do you think this intimidation and fear created in a place like Somalia, whether by the state or non-state actors, has actually worked? Because at this moment, it's very difficult to get any information out of Somalia. Do you think that this intimidation and killing has actually worked and no news is coming out?
Absolutely. When journalists are facing the kind of risk they face in Somalia of being attacked by either government or non-government actors and being killed or otherwise violently attacked, it acts as a deterrent effect against journalists coming to that country and trying to report the situation. But if you look at it more broadly, violence against journalists, in particular murders of journalists, are an ongoing problem that end up discouraging journalists from pursuing tough or difficult stories and tend to lead many journalists to engage in self-censorship in order to avoid being targeted for death. We have to keep in mind that nearly 3 out of 4 journalists killed on the job are not war correspondents, but are local journalists who are murdered, and most often murdered in their own nations. And the impunity rate for murdering journalists, for the perpetrators getting away with it, is 85%. So in nearly 9 out of 10 journalist murder cases, no one is convicted whatsoever. And this certainly is a deterrent effect against journalists pursuing sensitive information in a great many nations around the world, including nations, long-established democracies, including the ones you mentioned, as well as Colombia and others.
Wadda Khanfar, you say that we desperately need to ensure the protection of journalists and find a way of winning back journalism from these centers of power who are trying to hijack journalism. I wonder, how do we do it?
I think, first of all, you know, the profession itself, the principles of this profession should be maintained by us as journalists, as independent journalism. You know, I think we should not dissociate ourselves from the audience that we are reporting to. We should always take into consideration the human being and put him at the center of our editorial policy. We should not think of ourselves as an elite that has its own interest, commercial or political interest. We should not favor a sort of ideology or political orientation in our coverage. This kind of ideal that we stand for, or code of ethics that we should embrace, will protect us and will give us some kind of credibility. I think the only way that journalism can be embraced, or journalists could be protected as well by the people, by the masses, by the audience themselves, is through introducing the truth to the people, through being truthful and honest for this profession, and not to be part of this game that is taking place. We have paid heavy price, and we will continue to pay heavy price. Journalists always going to be, targeted by politicians and be targeted by other groups and so on and so forth. So it is a heavy price, but this heavy price definitely is very important to pass through this situation of a crisis that we are going through.
Abdul Wahab Al-Afandi, Mr. Khanfar talks about this uniform solidarity, and he also speaks about this code of ethics. Wouldn't some say that this is hard to put into practice because most media outlets serve different masters?
No, I think there are two things here. First of all, I think the credibility sometimes is not a protection against this kind of virus, because these people go especially after journalists who are credible. If a journalist is corrupt or doesn't have credibility, then they don't fear him. So most of the journalists who have been attacked, who have been held, Al Jazeera have been attacked because people were afraid of its credibility. So I must say that this might not be the only solution, but I think the solidarity of the profession, which again we haven't seen enough of in Sami al-Hajj's case. I mean, for example, I was watching some of the Arab channels, news channels, when Sami al-Hajj was released, and there wasn't even a bit of news about the release of Sami al-Hajj in some of these channels. So how could we expect the others to have solidarity with the journalists when the media organizations themselves do not look at the journalist as if he is a journalist? So I think the way is to promote this solidarity between journalists, and I think Waddah is right, more rapport with the audience, so that this is what protected Sami al-Hajj. I think what helped him and brought this sympathy, worldwide sympathy with him, that the people that felt that Al Jazeera was a credible organization and in touch with the people.
Final word quickly from Frank Smith. There's only 30 seconds left on the program. Asim al-Hajj, Sami al-Hajj's brother, has called for some sort of international investigation into Sami's years at Guantanamo. Do you think that's realistic, or it's maybe just a fancy?
Well, there are many questions that remain unanswered from the Pentagon's detention of Sami al-Hajj for so long without charging him. We've made many inquiries of the Pentagon in his case and gotten some responses, but certainly all of the responses have been inadequate. And what we need is to, as was said before, is to create a climate of solidarity that cuts across national, geographic, and cultural lines for journalists and journalist organizations to stand up for each other whenever journalists are attacked, and then no matter what form they may be attacked.
Gentlemen, it's been fascinating hearing your thoughts. Waddah Khanfar, Abdul Wahab Al-Afandi, and Frank Smith, thank you very much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye for now.